Hello and welcome to English 451A, American Literature from its origins to the 1860s. I'll be your instructor, Dr. Sam Lackey, and I'm excited to get started. What I'd like to do here to begin is just provide a brief introductory lecture. I'm going to have a real week one lecture posted a little bit later in the week, but for now, I just want to introduce the class, give you guys an idea of what to expect, talk a little bit about what we're doing in here, go over the syllabus, talk about some required materials, and then towards the end of this lecture, I'll at least introduce our first book of the semester, The Narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. I would like you to have this edition, so we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll get you ready to start reading, and then my week one lecture to be posted probably on Tuesday will actually get into the book. And we're going to spend 2 weeks reading this first book. So we're covering it this week and next week. You'll have until the end of week 2 to finish it. So that might be good news if you're still waiting for the book to arrive, or if you have not ordered your books yet. It will be important to do that soon. Okay, so I just want to start with some basic introductory stuff. If you're watching this lecture, I assume you've probably already visited our weekly modules in Canvas. I know you guys have taken other classes here before, so you know how Canvas works. I don't have to explain that to you, but obviously it is important to check out our weekly modules at the beginning of each week. So I always post the modules first thing Monday morning, and we have the entire week to complete whatever it is that we are doing that week. So like a lot of other classes, all of my written work, all of the assignments will be due by 11:59 Sunday night, right before midnight. So the week begins first thing on Monday, and it will end right before midnight on Sunday. So that's pretty standard. You'll find everything that you need to get started in the week one module. So you can take a look at the overview for the week. That's basically written lecture notes that I provide you guys. You can read through those at your leisure. You'll also find a link to these lectures. There's always a lecture in each week's module. It's up to you when you want to watch. I generally recommend that students complete most of the reading for the week before they watch my lecture, because sometimes my lectures will contain spoilers. Sometimes I might mention something that happens at the end of the book, and if you're not there yet, that might be a little bit disappointing for you. So just be warned and make whatever decision works best for you. You're welcome to watch the lecture first thing and then read later, whatever you want to do. But I'll always have a lecture. I'll always have notes. I'll always have the assignments posted. So we have weekly discussion posts. You can always find those links in the weekly modules. I'll tell you what we are reading for that week. And if anything larger is due, one of our short essays, or one of, maybe our final paper, or the midterm exam, the final exam, all of those assignments will, of course, be posted in Canvas. There'll be links to all of them. You can read the instructions for all of them, and you can see all the due dates. But another thing to check out in the week one module will be the course syllabus. So you guys can take a look at it whenever you get a chance here in week one. You don't have to read it word for word, but take a look. There is some important information contained within this document. So you can see my contact info. You see the required texts. So all of the books that you need to either buy or rent for the semester. They're all listed, and I would like you to get the editions that I am specifying here on the syllabus. You can also go to the GBC bookstore website, and I've ordered all of these books through the bookstore. So they're all listed there, and you can order them there. You can also go to Google and find the books yourselves. You can find ebook versions of a lot of these. You can find used copies of a lot of these. So you're welcome to save money in whatever way you can. If you don't feel like buying them, you can often just rent them for the semester and then return them, whatever you want to do. But get the books and let me know if you need any help getting the books, or if a delivery has been delayed, if you need some more time, or if you need me to perhaps give you a link to a free copy online. Sometimes I can do that. Other times there just isn't one. So I can help out as much as I can, but ultimately you do need the books, okay, starting with the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca, and you can see all of the others. Everything not listed here, there are some other reading assignments that we're getting to over the course of the semester, but everything not listed under required materials will be provided by me. Okay, so some weeks we're going to have PDFs. You might even have links that you can visit and you can read some stuff online. I'll do that when possible, but I want you to have these books listed on page 1. There's only, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 7 of them, okay? But again, they're paperbacks. A lot of them can be had very cheap. But try to pay attention to the specific info that I'm providing, the ISBN numbers, the year of publication, because in a lot of these cases, like with Cabeza de Vaca, I want you guys to have this recent scholarly edition that was put out by the University of Nebraska Press about 20 years ago. All right. There are other versions you can find, but they're not as good. This is the definitive version of the text. And in addition to having a really good translation and being very easy to read, this also has a nice critical apparatus that I think you guys are going to find useful. That means a critical intro written by the editors, and also footnotes. A lot of necessary context and explanation, because this is a weird book. It's not very hard to read, but you need context. You need the editors, and to some extent me, you need some people telling you things. You need to have some information provided to you up front before you jump into the narrative. So I'll try to do some of that through my lectures, but you can also get a lot of that from the footnotes, the appendix, and the critical introduction to the book. And I would like you guys to start by reading that critical intro. It's a little bit long, but you'll thank me later. You'll be grateful once you get started on the actual book. You'll be grateful to have read the intro. All right, so try to order those books as soon as possible if you have not already. You can also find in the syllabus, all of my rules and policies. You can see all of the assignments are listed along with point values. You can see the grading scale that we are using in this class. But the most important thing really in here, other than the required materials, is the detailed class schedule that you can look at beginning on page 4. All right. In Canvas, I typically only publish the modules 1 week at a time. All right. So if you want to look ahead, if you want to work ahead, if you want to get a jump start on a particular book or a particular writing assignment, you can see everything that we're doing throughout the semester in my detailed class schedule. So take a look at that. You might want to hang on to it. I would recommend you could either print out the syllabus, as I've done, or you can at least download it or save it to your device so you can keep it handy, so you can refer to it throughout the semester. Okay, so you can see everything that we're reading on a week-to-week basis. You can see the due dates for the written assignments. You can see, everything that we're getting to all the way up to the final exam and the final paper at the very end of the semester. So if you have any questions about the schedule, let me know. But it's just a good thing to look at, especially, like I said, if you want to work ahead, if you fall behind at a certain point, you might want to see what's going on with the schedule so you can catch up. And also, if you know in advance that you're going to be away from home or away from school, I know it's an online class, but if you're going to be gone for a week, if you're going on vacation with your family, if you have some work thing that's going to be very, very time consuming, and you know that you're not going to be very active in class on a particular week, you can plan for that. You can even tell me that. If you need an extension on an assignment, if you're going to miss a discussion post, we have weekly discussions. If you're going to miss one, you can always let me know. You can always look ahead using the class schedule. All right, so if you guys have any questions about the syllabus or anything that you see in the syllabus, just email me. Like I said, my contact, well, I'm not sure if I said this, but my contact info is on page 1, my email. I've also provided my office phone number. I'm located in Winnemucca, and I do hold office hours on Mondays and Wednesdays. So if any of you are near Winnemucca, or if you live in the town, you can stop by and visit me during office hours. Otherwise, the best way for us to communicate in an online class is, of course, email. Email me with any questions you might have, concerns, scheduling conflicts, anything that you need to talk about. Don't hesitate. You're not bothering me. Answering emails is a big part of my job. I teach a lot of online classes, like most faculty here at GBC. So I check my email every day. I have no problem answering questions, talking, maybe reassuring, doing whatever I need to do. And if you want a more sort of extensive bit of communication, we can also schedule Zoom calls. I can do that during my office hours or on other days. Just let me know what works for you. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it as far as the syllabus and Canvas. Again, I assume you guys know how to navigate Canvas by now. You know how to read a course syllabus. But just keep in mind, this is a literature class. This is a 400 level literature class, and we have an extraordinary amount of ground to cover. So I mentioned before that we are starting American literature with the origins. Now, the origins of American Lit have been discussed and debated, talked about by scholars for a long time. And that's actually a debate that we can enter as we get started with the class. When does American literature really begin? There's a lot of potential answers to that question. You can see that my choice leans a little bit towards older, right? I'm not just thinking about the U.S. as it currently exists, because as we know, the United States, compared to other countries, has not been around for very long. We've only been a nation since the end of the 18th century. Now, Cabeza de Vaca was writing in the 16th century, the 1500s. So we're going back in time to a much earlier period, a period that predates U.S. history. But remember, this is American Lit, so we can expand our perspective a little bit. We're not just thinking about the U.S., we're thinking about the Americas. Right? And there's not just one America. There's North America, there's Central America, and there's South America. So it's a much bigger realm than we sometimes think about when we're just focusing on the U.S. or one particular part of the hemisphere. Now, we're mostly focusing on the U.S. Almost everything else that we read will have kind of a U.S. lineage. But in some ways, this book does too, because Cabeza de Vaca, even though he doesn't know it yet, he actually spends a lot of time in the future United States. He's in Florida, near Tampa. He ends up up on the Gulf Coast in what is now Mississippi and Louisiana. He ends up in Texas as well, before eventually moving down into Mexico as part of this very long and crazy journey that he sort of unwittingly undertakes. So he is in the future U.S. But why this book is interesting to us and why I think it fits into the overall schema of the class is it really helps us locate the early stages of New World exploration and also the beginning of European colonization in the Americas. And of course, that was happening in South America, that was happening in Mexico, and that was also happening in the future U.S., in North America, but also Canada, even further north. So that's a theme, colonial relations, expansion, exploration, and all of the different things, good and bad, that come along with those. Those are common threads that we can track throughout the Americas and other parts of the world too. But certainly they characterize the entire New World, not just the future U.S. So the fact that we can sort of think a little bit about Spanish colonialism in the very early stages of it will be helpful. And then we can think a little bit about English colonialism in the future U.S. And then we can move into some more maybe recognizable national types of writings. But here at the beginning, there is no U.S. What there is a battle going on between European powers, Spain, England, France, among others, and they are trying to acquire new territory. They're also trying to acquire people. They're also trying to acquire natural resources. We're not going to get too deeply into colonial history, but we are going to learn a little bit about it through these first few weeks. Okay, and for us, that's the origin, that's the beginning. And we go all the way to the eve of the Civil War, around 1860. That's where we stop. So we are covering roughly 300 years of history in this hemisphere, in the Americas. That's a lot. So obviously, this is a long-winded way of me telling you that we are covering a lot of ground. We are reading a lot. We can't be comprehensive when we're covering this much time, but we are going to do our best. Water break. We're going to get some representative texts from a lot of different historical periods. And we're also going to be tracking the development and the growth of American literature, something that would eventually be recognized and identified and labeled as American literature. As you'll notice, that's going to be an ongoing process. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen as soon as we become an independent nation at the end of the 1700s. We don't just wake up the next day with our own national literature. It takes time. And there's lots of different influences and factors that go into this evolution that we're going to track, talk about, argue about, and think about more. So one way to consider this class, one way to kind of look at it, is a sort of a literary history. We're taking a tour of the beginnings of American literature, from the very beginnings all the way up to the middle of the 19th century. So if you guys are prepared to work hard and do a lot of reading and to do your best to keep up with my schedule, I think we can have fun. I like to keep things relatively light, but the reading load is going to be somewhat heavy. I just want to give you that warning. I know you guys have taken literature classes before, but because we have so much ground to cover, sometimes we are moving kind of fast. So in some cases, we might have to get through an entire book in a single week. And some of you will be able to do that, and others, you might be a little bit behind. But I just want to say, don't panic if you do fall a little behind. Again, try to stick to my schedule in the syllabus try to stick to it as much as you can. But I know life gets in the way sometimes, family obligations, work obligations. So let's say we're finishing up Hope Leslie in like week 6 or week 7, I think. And we're supposed to finish it by the end of the week, but maybe you still have 70, 80 pages left. That's not a huge deal, okay? You can catch up. And one thing that you're going to notice is that not all of our weeks are created equal. So some weeks are going to be very reading intensive. Like the week that we do Hope Leslie, it's a pretty long book. I only have 1 week to devote to it, so we are moving pretty quickly. But then other weeks, you're not going to have quite as much to read. So there'll be some weeks where we actually aren't working on a novel. We might just be reading a few poems. We might be taking a look at a couple of short stories or some other shorter excerpts. So that means on a week like that, you can either play catch up if you've fallen behind previously, or you can try to work ahead. Again, looking at the schedule, you might say, oh man, in a couple of weeks, we're getting hit hard with a lot of reading. So let me get a jump start now because I've already finished the reading for this week. This week was pretty light, but in 2 weeks, it's going to be rough. So let me get started now so I don't have to read so much 2 weeks from now. I'm going to leave it up to you guys to make those kinds of decisions. You guys know your schedules better than I do. So I would like you to find a weekly routine that works well for you when it comes to, like I said, watching the lecture, taking a look at the weekly overview, completing the reading, and doing the weekly discussion post. You have the full week to do whatever we're trying to do that week. So be a good judge of time, make smart decisions, and if you're ever struggling or if you have questions, just let me know. All right, so I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the class in general. Get into the habit of doing those weekly discussions as well. I know most of you probably have experience with those in other classes. I want you to talk to each other a little bit. I will require sometimes that you respond to a classmate. That's really the whole point, right? The discussion board is sort of an online way of simulating what would be a traditional in-class discussion. So we're never going to be in the same room together for a real in-class discussion, but we can do the next best thing online by sharing our observations, our thoughts about what we're reading. I'll also give you some specific prompts to respond to, but it's just a way to share ideas. We're kind of helping each other out. We can, address one another, disagree as long as you're doing it respectfully, but you'll be surprised. You can get a lot of valuable insight from your classmates, obviously from me too, but you can learn things from each other as well. So read each other's posts, try to respond to some of your classmates' posts, and of course, post yourself, okay? It's just a good way for us to talk, maintain kind of a running dialogue throughout the class, and also we're practicing. We're practicing analyzing these texts. We're trying out different ideas, different interpretations, and sometimes, I often see this over the course of a semester, a good discussion post might be the seed or the beginning of a later essay. You might return to one of your posts and say, you know what, I want to keep working on the ideas that I was getting into here. I want to return to the text I was talking about and maybe do more with it. All right. Just a couple of quick things. There will be some optional readings in the weekly modules, but those are optional. If you have time to read them, great. If not, that's okay. I'll never test you on the optional readings, and I'll never make you write on them if you don't want to. But for the required materials, those 7 books that I've listed on the syllabus, you will be tested on those. There's a few other required materials that I will be able to provide you in PDF form, or I can give you a link. But if it's required, you are responsible for it. both in exam form and essay form. So just be aware of that. But if it's optional, you're never going to be held responsible. All right. Any other questions, or if there's anything that's unclear, just email me and we can talk more. All right, so I'll finish up this intro lecture by just talking briefly about the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. Again, get this edition from the University of Nebraska Press from 2003. And if you can't find it, if you don't have the funds to purchase it currently, get in touch with me. We'll figure something out. I would like you guys to begin with the critical intro. It's roughly 37 pages. So it is long, but worthwhile. So read that first, and then you can get started on the actual narrative. The narrative begins on page 44, okay? And it ends on page 176. So it's not terribly long compared to some of the other books that we are reading this semester. So you'll notice we have 2 weeks for this. There's several reasons for that. Number one, it's a very strange narrative. So even though I don't think it's very difficult to read, I still want to give you guys plenty of time to get through it, because there's just a lot of adjustments that you'll have to make, both on the level of language and subject matter. It's just going to feel rather unfamiliar and strange, especially when you first start reading it. And you're also going to notice that Cabeza de Vaca isn't always the most reliable narrator. Sometimes he leaves out important information. Sometimes he skips over really important events. So again, just reading him isn't enough. You need the scholarly, critical apparatus that an edition like this provides. You have scholars like Rolina Adorno and Patrick Potts who are giving you footnotes and the intro and the historical context that you need to be able to fill in some of the gaps and fully understand what's going on here. Okay, so start with the intro, and honestly, guys, if that's all you can read in week one, if you're kind of swamped with other stuff going on here at the beginning of the semester and all you can get to is the critical intro, that's fine. You should have enough time to finish the book in week 2. But if you want to get moving on the text itself, the narrative itself, you should have time later this week, depending on what your schedule looks like. All right. But yeah, don't feel rushed. We are spending 2 full weeks on the book. And again, you guys know how fast of a reader you are, how you like to work, how you like to move through a book. So you can make your own decisions when you have a little bit of time like we do here. Just a few things I wanted to mention, things that I would like us to talk about soon once we've gotten started. And just another reminder, I will have a true week 1 lecture about the first half of the book. We're going to break up the narrative into roughly 2 halves. So I'll cover part 1 here in week 1, and then we'll cover part 2 next week in the week 2 module. So I will get into the book later this week in the week 1 module. For now, I just want to kind of introduce it and just mention a few things to kind of get you ready, because this is not typical of the sort of thing that we would normally read in a literature class. So one thing to keep in mind is that this is first and foremost not a work of literature. It is not a work of fiction, at least not in the traditional strict sense. Most of what we are reading this semester consists of novels and short stories and poems. This is none of those things. This is meant to be taken as a true account of things that really happened. So by definition, it is meant to be nonfiction, right? And it's not very literary We normally expect certain things from literature, right? We expect what we might refer to as literary devices. Stuff like figurative language, symbolism, well-developed characters, maybe extensive use of dialogue between characters, and then ultimately some type of larger theme that we can pick out and sort of analyze once we're finished reading. So those are the kinds of literary features or elements that we would expect to find in a novel or a short story or a poem, but we don't find many of them here. You might argue, there is a little bit of figurative language at times, a little bit of dialogue. There are some characters, though they might not be very well developed aside from the narrator, but we can still take this largely as an adventure story, or at least it has the form and the shape of a lot of adventure fiction that we might be familiar with. There's sort of a protagonist here, our narrator. There's lots of unexpected, death-defying events taking place. There is some action. They cover an amazing amount of ground, largely on foot or on homemade rafts. And like I mentioned before, much of the book takes place in the future U.S., whether it's Florida, the Gulf Coast, or Galveston Island off the coast of Texas. So, in some ways, some scholars have made the argument that even though it wasn't intended to be a work of fiction, even though it's not supposed to be an adventure story, it kind of functions that way. It has a lot of the ingredients that we would recognize in a more traditional adventure novel. So that's one way to kind of think about it, but as far as what it really is, what it was intended to be, like I said, it's a historical document, and there is a genre that we can assign it to. It's considered an official account, or what is sometimes called a letter of relation. And this was an official type of document, usually written by a soldier or a nobleman and addressed to some royal personage, normally a king. So this was a very specific genre that came out of the era of exploration, also the beginning of European colonialism. So whenever there was a big expedition organized by the Spanish crown or the British crown or the French crown, they would have these royal expeditions designed to go and explore islands or other parts of the Americas that were still unknown. And of course, the goal wasn't just to explore, but also to claim that land as belonging to Spain or England or France or whoever was organizing the expedition. So that's exactly what's going on here. Cabeza de Vaca is a member of the Narváez expedition, and they leave Cuba, which had already been colonized by the Spanish. They leave Cuba with the intention of traveling to northeastern Mexico to basically expand the Spanish territorial holdings in the New World. So you got to remember, we are in the 1520s, I think, or maybe the 1530s here. Spanish colonialism was still in its infancy. So they had already conquered Mexico. They had already conquered several islands in the Caribbean, but they didn't possess all of Mexico. They had a big part of it, but they hadn't fully explored the northern parts of Mexico. And they had very little idea what was north of Mexico, which was, of course, the future U.S. There had been some exploration of the future U.S. coast, particularly the Florida coast, and some other areas maybe in the southeast. But those had taken place from boats primarily. Like, I think in 1513, Ponce de Leon had explored the coast of Florida, but again, they mostly did it on board their ships. They only went to the land very briefly, and they got into some conflict with Native Americans, and they fled before they could really learn very much. So the Spanish didn't know much about the shape or the extent of North America. They didn't know what was beyond their holdings in Mexico. So that was the whole point of the Narvaez expedition, which Cabeza de Vaca was an official member of. I think he was the treasurer. So it was his job. It was part of his job description to write the official letter of relation. And he's addressing it to King Charles of Spain. That's really his audience, the royal court. He's not writing for a popular audience. He's not really trying to entertain us. Instead, letters of relation had very specific functions. They were supposed to serve very specific roles. So they were largely informational in nature. They were describing this new place to royal people who had never seen it, who had never been there. Right? King Charles had never been to the New World, so he needed it explained to him. So the whole idea is the letter of relation would include important info about natural resources, about Native Americans, about the geography. What kind of landscape was it? Is it mountainous? Is it mostly, lush jungle? Is there a coast? Where is it? What does it look like? Where is it in relation to other Spanish colonies? Does it seem like a good candidate for a new Spanish colony? Is there good stuff there? These were kind of exploitative at their core, right? The goal was to conquer. The goal was to acquire. So if they learned that maybe there was gold or other valuable resources in this place, they were more likely to want to colonize that place and take it for their own. But of course, as we know, it's a little bit problematic for the Spanish or the British or the French to claim these places as their own when there were already people living there. And we're going to see that play out in the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca lives amongst Native Americans for roughly 7 years. He's one of the few survivors of this Narvaez expedition because as you will soon see, the expedition does not go according to plan. So Cabeza de Vaca, along with a few others, survive, but there's no more expedition. Right? They have to live amongst Native Americans in order to survive. And they do survive. And they cover all of this ground. They end up basically crossing the entire width of Mexico, from near the Atlantic coast all the way to near the Pacific coast, where they finally run in to other Spaniards. Hopefully I'm not giving too much away. Obviously, we know that Cabeza de Vaca survives because he lives long enough to write this book. But this particular narrative takes different shapes and forms over the years, and there are different versions of it. So that's something that we'll talk about more in the week 1 lecture. We don't have to worry about it right now. But he writes his own sort of version of events later on, once he returns to Spain. But his job on a typical expedition would have been to take notes and sort of write everything down that they were seeing so he could then compose the official letter of relation to send to the king. And he does that as best he can. Obviously, he doesn't have paper. He's naked a lot of the time. He's not in a position to write on a regular basis, but he is trying to still fulfill the obligations of the letter of relation. And you'll notice he's addressing King Charles. That's his audience, and his goal is to describe what he has seen. But of course, the expedition goes off the rails, so what he sees and what he experiences is very different from what you would normally find in this type of writing. So it has a history and a genre all its own. It's an official letter. It's a letter of relation. It's a historical document. And there are plenty of other examples from this era. this era of exploration. So Cortez wrote a letter of relation during his conquest of Mexico City, what is now Mexico City. Columbus wrote some of these as early as the 1490s, documenting, his explorations and conquests. So there was a long lineage of these types of letters. And in fact, we'll read some more. John Smith, on the British side, he writes a couple of these a little bit later on when he's exploring Massachusetts and Virginia, or what would later become Massachusetts and Virginia. So there's a long history. It's not just a Spanish thing. It's not just a Cabeza de Vaca thing. It's something that a lot of these explorations were creating, these letters of relation. Sometimes they're also referred to as expedition narratives because they are basically stories of the expedition, stories of these voyages, these missions to explore, conquer, and exploit the natural resources and the people living in these places. So Cabeza de Vaca is a part of all of that. We need to remember who he is. He is not a professional writer. He is not a novelist. He would not have thought of himself as any of those things. He was a career military man. He was from a sort of family of minor nobility in the south of Spain, and he enlisted as a soldier pretty early on. He served in different places, and he basically devoted his adult life to serving the Spanish crown in a military capacity. But as was the case back then in most European countries, a lot of military guys would have been pretty well educated. So Cabeza de Vaca went to school, he was literate. He was a pretty cultured, well-educated gentleman who was a career soldier, but he wasn't like a private. He was an officer, right? He was a kind of a big deal, not a super big deal, but kind of a big deal. He was enough of a big deal to be the treasurer on the Narvaez expedition. So he wasn't in charge, but he was one of the noblemen, one of the top military guys involved in the expedition. So he would have been kind of in a position of some authority. Not the ultimate authority, but he wasn't just a random dude. Okay, he was kind of a somebody. But he had no training as a writer. He had, experience writing. He wrote letters to his friends. Military guys had to do writing as well. But again, his mission, his goal wasn't to write an entertaining story about his adventures. It was to fulfill his duties. His job was to write the letter of relation for the king. But a lot of scholars, again, they point out that, that's the history of the text, but it kind of reads like an adventure novel. Other people have wondered if it's maybe kind of more of a personal narrative, a personal testimony. Some of it might read like a captivity narrative, because he is captured and held by various Native American groups at different times. At other times, he's very friendly with the Native Americans that he's living with. At some times, he functions as a slave. At other times, he's a merchant, or he seems to work as a medicine man or a healer. That comes a little bit later. We might not get to that until week 2. But He wears many hats during his travels. His situation changes a lot. So you need to be paying attention to what's going on. And again, he doesn't always explain things in the most common sense, straightforward way. Sometimes he does. But in other cases, he'll skip over information. And that's when you need to rely on the editors. That's when you need to rely on the footnotes and the critical intro, because they're going to fill in a lot of those gaps for you, like I was saying. I guess that's really enough for now. But again, we can think of this as really being the first in many ways. It's really the first detailed account written by a European of the future U.S. It's also the first detailed account of the native peoples who were living in the future U.S. And that's one of the most interesting things about this book, is the fact that Cabeza de Vaca, though he has no training and no background in the area, he kind of becomes an amateur anthropologist. because he observes all of these different native peoples. And at first he's very hostile towards them. And he's very dismissive because that's how most of the Spaniards were, quite frankly. But as his life starts to depend on some of these native peoples, as he begins to live with them and share their customs, he honestly kind of changes his outlook a little bit. And he starts to pay more attention to their culture, their language, their familial relations, their religion, what they eat, where they live, how they order their societies. And he's really providing some interesting info, though he gets a lot wrong. He's confused at times, but he really does provide one of the first pieces of European writing that foreground Native Americans. Again, John Smith mentions them. Other exploration narratives mention them, often briefly in passing. Cabeza de Vaca has no choice, though, but to actually learn a lot about them, because he's living with them for many, many years, as are the other survivors of the expedition. All right, so I'm going to end the intro lecture here, and we'll pick up with part 1 of the narrative in the week 1 lecture. Look for it by Tuesday afternoon, and I'll see you guys next time.